long 18th century. This morning's event is one of a number of gatherings that have brought together scholars from a broad array of geographical, institutional, and disciplinary perspectives who have been rethinking approaches to researching and teaching the art and material culture of an interconnected long 18th century. It's been a pleasure this year as director of the Institute to see this initiative develop in various ways. And I got a good glimpse of that a few weeks ago when Sarah Betzer, one of the conveners this morning, presented a Mellon seminar on this collaborative project to a number of our colleagues. One of the really striking things about a broad and exciting project like this, which came across during the Q&A and the seminar, is the desire of scholars across fields to associate themselves and their own subfields with this kind of transformative and far-reaching work, which seems to have implications for everyone who teaches in and around this pivotal century in social, intellectual, economic history. What about Spain and the Iberian Peninsula? What about the Scandinavian 18th century? What about music? For a scholar like me, and I'm trained as a medievalist, this whataboutism is particularly acute when it comes to the larger questions of periodization that guide this project. At least for Western Europe, it was the 18th century that was most responsible for the hypostatizing of the medieval world as the Dark Ages. In Gibbon's words, the words of the great 18th century historian, it was the darkness and confusion of the Middle Ages that had to dissipate for the 18th century and for modernity to come into its own as the true legacy of the Renaissance. Medievalists are used to this carving up of time and the world toward various ideological ends. And one of the really salutary aspects of this project, as I've seen it develop, is its refusal to concede to simplistic temporal schemes and to present its answers to questions of periodization as provisional and generative rather than conclusive and defensive. So I'm eager to learn more about this morning as we explore together the problem of teaching the long 18th century. The organizers have agreed to keep introductions short, so I'll just quickly introduce our two conveners who will then introduce our panelists for this morning's event. Sarah Betzer is professor of art at the University of Virginia, and this year an Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellow here at the IHGC. She's the author of Ingress in the Studio, Women Painting History from Penn State University Press, and of the forthcoming book, Animating the Antique, Sculptural Encounter in the Age of Aesthetic Theory, which comes out later this year. She's held fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Gallery of Art, and Downing College at Cambridge, among others. Dipti Khera is Associate Professor of Art History at NYU. She's the author most recently of The Place of Many Moods, Udaipur's Painted Lands in India's 18th Century from Princeton University Press in 2020, which won the American Institute of Indian Studies Edward Cameron Dimmock Jr. Prize. She's also co-curating the exhibition A Splendid Land, Paintings from Royal Udaipur, India, organized by the National Museum for Asian Art at the Smithsonian in partnership with the City Palace Museum in Udaipur. The exhibition is slated to open at the Freer and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. this coming fall, something in person to look forward to, and travel to the Cleveland Museum of Art in summer 2022. So welcome again to all of you, and Sarah and Dipti, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And thanks also to Anne Gilliam and the fantastic interns at the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures at UVA. Also, we need to thank the Department of Art and the Mellon Foundation for the support of this event. We also want to recognize the editorial board of Journal 18, who've been wonderful partners for Dipti and I, and great supporters of our work on the issue we're editing for this fall with the title, The Long 18th Century ? The central provocation signaled by the scare quotes around long and the question mark at the end of the title, the title of this issue, is our contention that we must understand the rise of a long 18th century alongside the significant transformation of art historical inquiry into expanded geographical and cultural terrains. What impact, if any, has a worlding of art history had upon our thinking about the relative length or shortness, narrowness, or breadth of the 18th century? What conceptually binds an 18th century once we've taken up the project of tracking the entanglements of art, commerce, and empire across worlds? For whom is the 18th century long? From what vantage points, whether local, regional, or trans-regional, and to what ends? These questions are taken up in our issue by way of a number of articles, but we were keen to bring into our orbit the work that's taking place in classrooms and research clusters, both because we believe that pedagogy is a core intellectual pursuit and because it is work with real ramifications for the future of our discipline. So how are we doing the long 18th century in our classrooms and research clusters? Today's roundtable will appear in distilled form in our fall issue, and the full recording will be linked to it. We invited our participants to anchor their short presentations by way of a salient episode, a syllabus, a research cluster, a course session, or an assignment, an online resource, or digital project. These episodes we imagine as the beginning of an assemblage of resources, very much in the spirit of the Journal 18 digital collaboration organized by Zerwat Chaudhary, Blackness, Immobility, and Visibility in Europe. And I think we can put the link in the chat here to this, which includes an interactive crowdsourced timeline, which is just really fantastic. Dipti, over to you. You're muted, Dipti.
Of course I am muted. So that's my perfect entry into this Zoom roundtable. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, IAGC. And I'll just expand a little bit on the key aims of this morning's roundtable and its afterlife in Journal 18. So our first aim is to reflect upon the long 18th century, particularly in light of renewed debates of the reparation of objects, revision of histories, inclusion of colonized and enslaved voices in museums, plantation sites, and public squares. What are the stakes of the long 18th century from different vantage points as we account for the histories of colonialism, enslavement, and extraction of bodies and lands, objects, and knowledge? How does this inquiry shift when we think from our pedagogical sides? And the second aim is to compile a list of resources and open access supporting material that are pragmatically useful for colleagues engaged in teaching the long and broad 18th century. We have not aimed for any kind of comprehensiveness to realize both of these aims. In fact, we are unable to fully account for the critical for all of the critical issues from climate change to COVID that are ravaging our existence and suffocating our claims, our lives. We look at this event as part of many such discussions that are already taking place and that will continue in the future. Our conversations too about the stakes of the long 18th century have unraveled in the long 2020s. Our pedagogical sites, the animating force for this discussion, have manifested on our Zoom screens, as we can all see, and they have manifested amid brutal violence and deaths. Through the past year, we have often inhabited and continue to inhabit non-intersecting physical spaces, disparate temporal realities, desperate emergencies, burdening limitations, unseen disabilities, and variously exhausted bodies. All of our speakers in their pedagogical work bring the ethics of care and justice at its core, which inspires us, and we hope it'll inspire you too, and for which we are truly grateful that they have joined us in this roundtable. So with us today morning are Anna Arabindan Keeson, who is an assistant professor at Princeton University, a scholar of African American, Caribbean, and British art, and her digital project, Pathologies of Difference, examines the intersections of art, race, and medicine in the British Empire. Welcome, Anna. Over to you, Sarah.
Nebahat Avcioglu is an associate professor at Hunter College, City University of New York. a specialist in Islamic architecture and art, with a particular emphasis on Ottoman European cultural encounters, she co-edited with Finbar Berry Flood a watershed special issue of Ars Orientalis, Globalizing Cultures, Art, and Mobility in the 18th Century. Welcome, Navi.
Emma Barker is a senior lecturer in art history at the Open University, London. A scholar of French 18th century art, she has been actively involved in creating the newly developed Open University course, Art and its Global Histories. Welcome, Emma.
Ananda Cohen-Aponte is Associate Professor of the History of Art at Cornell University, a scholar of the visual culture of colonial Latin America and the legacies of colonialism in contemporary Latinx art. She has been recognized for her efforts to create equity in the discipline of art history through the pilot project Pathways to Art History. Welcome, Ananda.
Preeta Meyer is my colleague first, and then an associate professor of art history at NYU, at the Institute of Fine Arts and in the Department of Art History. Her work centers on art and architecture of Africa and on port cities and visual cultures of the Indian Ocean world. Welcome, Preeta.
Nancy is Professor of Art History and Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Inclusion at Binghamton University, State University of New York. An active participant in digital art history initiatives, her research has charted trans-regional and multi-sited oceanic perspectives on the material, visual, and built culture on the Arabian Peninsula and around the rims of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Welcome, Nancy.
Steve Whiteman is the head of the Research Degrees Program and senior lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art, a scholar of the visual and spatial cultures of early modern China in their global context, and he's a member of trans-regional and global early modern clusters at the Courtauld. Welcome, Steve.
We were just convening just before we welcomed all of you, our participants, into the digital space of this Zoom, and saying that we're really trying to maintain as much as we can the spirit, the ethos of a roundtable, as if we were in a room gathered around a big seminar table together with all of the unforeseen things that can event in that kind of context. So we're in a virtual roundtable only with 317 or so folks in our orbit. So welcome to all of you whose faces we can't see, but who we know to be there and are delighted to have join us. One last vital introduction. We'd like to introduce you to another member of our team who's worked valiantly to ensure that news of this event would circulate broadly and that it would run as smoothly as possible. Eleanor Newman is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Art at the University of Virginia. In her dissertation, Eleanor studies the imbrication of landscape, gender, and empire through the visual and verbal landscapes produced by the British artist and author Mariah Graham, sorry about that, Eleanor, as she traveled globally in the early 19th century. Eleanor will be helping moderate our Q&A today.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Dipti. As a reminder to everyone, we are recording this session. The IHGC will not take photographs, and we ask that you do not either. Each of our panelists will speak for about 8 to 9 minutes, and we'll do about 30 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have any comments throughout the presentations, please use the chat function, and any questions can go in the Q&A box. And with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Anna Arabindin Kesson.
Thank you so much. While I share my screen, I just want to say thank you again to Dipti and Sarah and Eleanor for organizing this amazing event. It's such an honor to be on this panel with so many amazing speakers whose work I really admire. I feel I'm a little bit of an interloper, given my work is generally in in the 19th and the 21st centuries, but the projects I will speak about today show how I am also entering this chronology of the long 18th century. So I'm coming to you today. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wadandi, Pinjarap, and Elap Noongar people. I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. I want to, in Australia, we start with land acknowledgements in most events. As symbolic as they may be, I do want to just kind of hold on to that acknowledgement, because for me, what a land acknowledgement does is remind me that place is always contested. It reminds me of the multiplicity of positions and locations, and it reminds me of the frameworks that are embedded in space that are not my own, and that are not the kind of colonial Western models. I want to start with this image of a plantation map by Benjamin Haynes, because I think it helps us see some of the dynamic that theorist and writer Sylvia Wynter discusses in terms of the relationship between the plantation and the plot. And this is coming from a new project I'm working on called The Global Plantation. And Wynter sort of talks about this dynamic between plantation and plot, relying on, in part, the idea of narrative. The parcel of land that you see here, which is sort of within this plantation map, is a space here where enslaved people would have been, and these are the kind of architecture and apparatus of the plantation. These parcels of land that Wynter calls plots suggest at least the multiplicity of other narratives that exist outside the orientation of the plantation, which in essence is a structure that organizes space, but also organizes human environmental relationships, and organizes vision. The plantation essentially creates a spatial relationship between us and the landscape. And in a similar way, I think we can think of objects like this, colonial objects, as modes of organizing vision and space and vision, and modes of organizing relationships between past and present. What I've been trying to work on and think about more and more in my teaching and research is how objects like this ask us to see with them. And I'm trying to really kind of grapple with the implications of that positionality. Increasingly, I've been challenged by writers like scholars like Deborah Thomas, Tina Camp, Saidiya Hartman, to think about colonialism's reliance on the ocular as the means of knowledge production, and the relationship between seeing, interpretation, and knowing that objects like these and their histories have left us. So my new project, which is called Art, which was Pathologies of Difference, and is now sort of morphed into a kind of larger project called ArtHX, Visual and Medical Legacies of British Colonialism, is an attempt to address some of these questions about ways of seeing, their historical production, and their continued significance in art history. Now, I became an art historian because it is a discipline that revolves around asking how and why we see. In my former life as a nurse, these were questions that I was consistently faced with as well, and art history was the discipline that to me seemed to be able to engage and work through these questions most fully. I've also been struck with how medicine relies on a similar kind of vision, this emphasis on observation, transforming observation into meaning. Bodies become legible through particular forms of analysis that have in turn been produced through historical frameworks. But one thing that when I was working and training as a nurse, was that we were always taught to consider other forms of interpretation beyond sort of visual analysis in a sense, that relied much more on the relational nature of patient care. And so I'm just kind of setting this out because I really want to emphasize that my approach to teaching and research, and I emphasize this to my students too, is really a personal one, that it has emerged and continues to emerge from these intersections that I've experienced in my professional lives and personal lives, and my continual attempt to negotiate these experiences and their relationship to the contingencies of the ocular. And so ART-HX sort of is meant to kind of bring some of those questions out. It's also directly addressing those questions in the name, because HX is actually a clinical abbreviation that we would use in medicine to represent history. So it's sort of coming at this question of the relationship between art and these medical histories in multiple ways. The project is object-centered. It's focused on a database of objects that my students, Bhavani Srinivas, Jessica Womack, Phoebe Warren, and Sidna Taylor, they are a dream team of women, are continuing to compile from archives and museum collections. And then that database is, we have organized it according to different categories and tags. And so I won't show it here, but the link is there and you're more than welcome to go and play around. But the project, in being so object-centered, it's also a project that attempts to really emphasize the relational nature of objects, the way that really it tries to emphasize the way objects tell these stories or their stories of entanglement. But it's also concerned with how we can represent these colonial histories, which are often violent and traumatizing, without reinscribing that trauma. And it also wants to ask viewers, like we want viewers to be considering how these objects are asking them to see with them. So asking them to consider their position and their orientation as they move through the objects. So the sort of this idea of object, or the kind of framework for our thinking in terms of working from objects in this way, comes from a couple of different methodologies. One is, of course, the Jules Prown's idea of the object as portal, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. But also, I've been really inspired by Arundhati Roy's idea of the pandemic as a portal. And so, her point about this idea of a portal is that it is a way, it's a gateway between one world and the next. It's a way to imagine a future. And so for us, at ART-HX, we're obviously wanting these objects to kind of unfold histories, but also from that unfolding, allow a space to imagine and create the potential, right, to imagine other futures of relation and of care and of value. So one way that we've tried to do that is and I have to say that a lot of these kind of interventions that we're all working through have come from my students. We talk about them. It's a very collaborative project. We meet together. We sort of discuss ways of engaging with the objects, and the students have been really wonderful in kind of formulating their responses and the kind what we've called sort of notes, also kind of riffing off the idea of case notes. And so most recently, students have created audio responses to these objects that really emphasize the dialogic nature of an object. So these responses are meant to be really a kind of dialogue between the student's kind of contemporary lens that they're bringing and the kind of historical world that this object is unfolding. And it's been really wonderful to hear and see them talk about how this kind of research and visual analysis has helped them see things differently, subjectively, but also, see kind of histories of medicine or contemporary practices of medicine in different ways than they did before. And for me, I think this particular exercise is really powerful because it's a way for me to respond to Tina Camp's really wonderful provocation, right? That we need to look for the affective dimensions of an object, or even Daphne Brooks' kind of wonderful description of archives in her her opening, where she's talking about this desire for us to listen to and for archival objects. She describes wanting the archive to kind of sing to her, but I think that sense, that kind of relationship with the archive is kind of what I've seen kind of come out of some of these responses from my students. Sorry, let's go off again. And so we also have organized the project through sort of three lenses that we hope will help us, again, do that work of kind of unfurling, but also imagining and speculating more deeply. So these themes are kind of meant to help viewers understand how objects open onto the past and how they continue to frame, or how we can use them to imagine new presents. And then the final two things I just want to mention is that the students have also come up with ways of visualizing this dialogic nature of interpretation to emphasize multiplicity, the multisensorial process of transforming looking into analysis, and to emphasize the methodologies of interpretation, and the subjective nature of interpretation, the ways objects can spark meaning and association, and in this way try to destabilize some of that logic embedded into colonial forms of looking. So this website was developed by Ben Johnson, a colleague at the Magura Center at Princeton. But Bhavani Srinivas has been really important to its design. So one of her ideas was to kind of create this network map, which is basically, a way of trying to map connections across these different ideas of art, race, and medicine. Medicine was used to differentiate the colonial empire in different ways through, ideas about race or geography, climate, disease. And this is a way of trying to maybe destabilize those differentiations. And also to maybe track some of the ways objects moved, and the way those movements perhaps created kind of unseen or unacknowledged forms of connection and relation. And the final kind of data visualization tool that we've been working on, and I think is really, for me, a really important way of mapping my own research process, and I think for students, mapping how we might do a kind of visual analysis, is a constellation map. So this was an idea that was Bhavani and Phoebe Warren put together. And the idea of this is really to sort of emphasize, to help people see how we come to ideas, how we come to these understandings of the intersections of objects and their histories. And a constellation map is really about juxtaposing objects and trying to follow connections, but in a way that also allows for tangents and allows for different kinds of spaces of expression and experience to emerge. To me, the constellation map is really similar to the ways what we think of as sort of the differential diagnosis of medicine, which is really about following the symptoms, right, and to eventually get to the right interpretation. But in this idea, or in this framework, the idea of the constellation is to follow, but also visualize that dialogic nature of interpretation, tracing how objects lead to others, allowing spaces for non-visual sources, for the transhistorical and transnational nature of objects. That doesn't necessarily have to end with a correct position, but allows for this multiplicity. It allows for speculation. It allows for other approaches, and I think ultimately it requires a great deal of care in how we approach our historical material. Care both in terms of careful attention, so carefulness, but also care for the kinds of stories that are emerging from these processes of interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that tantalizing encounter with ArtHX. It's really exciting. We'll pass the torch to Nevi.
Mute myself. Thank you very much, and share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, Dipti, Sarah, and Eleanor, for organizing the event. I am delighted to hear Anna's talk before me, a fascinating project, and the rest of the participants, of course. I look forward to our discussion at the end. For this occasion, I choose the Research Methods Seminar that I taught in spring 2020, called Scrutinizing the Western Gaze, the Turk in 18th Century European Art. The idea was prompted by the invitation in 2019 by Oxford University Press to write a refereed bibliographic article on Turkery, because I wrote a book on Turkery, for the Oxford Bibliographies Online, which is just out, and I will come to that at the very end. The figure of the Turk is quite exceptional in European art history. Although not originated in the 18th century, it was during this period that it emerged as a social, political, and aesthetic catalyst for several of the most salient features of the Enlightenment's epistemological program. In literature and in the arts, its advocates portray the Turk in playful, antagonistic, or innocuous terms, creating a genre in itself that came to be known as Turkery. Some scholars variously mark the beginning of Turkery with the fall of Constantinople to draw attention to the longue durée historicity of Ottoman-European relations. Others, focusing on intensification of trade and mobility, dates its origins to around the period of the failed Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683. While little consensus may exist, most art historians are focused on the 18th century. However, where to place the chronological cursor has been important for questioning the role of France as the sole innovator of Turkery, or for stressing the importance of including architecture or ephemera, such as pamphlets, popular entertainment, or warfare material into its histories. these approaches, these different kinds of approaches, starting from the fall of the Constantinople, to the history, starting from the fall of Constantinople to the end of the 18th century, even into the 19th century, effectively pluralized the subject of Turquerie or Turqueries. And this is the reason I decided to teach this material, because it provides a very rich and complex historiographical tradition. But how to teach it was an important question. Even though I wrote the book, I never gave a course on Turquerie before. But when this opportunity came up to prepare a reference digital bibliography, I thought, well, this might be a good way to try something innovative. I also wanted to teach the material as a category of connected and intercultural art, rich in methodological issues, particularly with regard to the issues of trade, travel, diplomacy, Orientalism, exoticism, and so on, that were mentioned at the beginning of today's panel. So when I was asked to prepare the bibliography, I thought this could be the topic of my research methods seminar and would allow me to design an innovative interactive course structure where instead of a final research paper, students would collectively participate in the compilation of a digital reference work and take part in the publication by Oxford University Press. Well, when I asked my students who took the course at the beginning, why were you interested in this particular topic? And their first reaction was that it had a publication component to it. So they were very happy to participate in this prospect. As teachers, we all want our students to empower themselves by taking control of the pedagogic process, concretely to identify their own sources, to bring their own questions to the material, and to reflect critically on the different methods of answering them. To achieve these goals, I often emphasize group work in my other courses as well as experimenting with digital humanities. I use Wikipedia, Google Map, or online exhibitions with my students quite regularly. The Turquerie course, the course that I discussed today, was one such experimental approach, and I think it worked quite well, even though I had to make some last-minute changes to the syllabus and the program. This was a very ambitious project because we were expected to read between 80 to 100 works in one semester. I realized that this wasn't going to be possible with a conventional syllabus. So I provided a long bibliography that I had compiled over the almost a century, it feels like, and shared the PDFs of all the readings with the entire class. I also divided my students into 4 groups of 3. And each group was given 3 readings per week. So we covered 4 different topics each week. Each student provide their own annotations and then work together to come up with a final version. However, they ended up writing summaries instead of annotations, of course, which is very interesting. And one student from each group was asked to also present the readings with a PowerPoint presentation. So So each student would give at least 5 presentations throughout the semester. We continued in this way until week 11, and the rest of the semester was devoted to refining the categories and the subsections of the bibliography. I provided my own version and they provided their own. That was also very interesting to see how they were thinking with this very broad material. At some point, I realized that not all participants had the same enthusiasm. So in the end, instead of the collective final project, I asked them to pick a topic and provide a short annotated bibliography of their own, which worked really well in the end. And I was able to obviously grade them with more certainty. What did students gain from this exercise? Certainly direct contact with sources, which facilitated and motivated students' reading of academic monographs and articles, because they can be read as models on how to select, interpret, and critique these sources, as opposed to relying passively on received wisdom of one or two articles or books. I think this approach also breathed new life into the unity of learning and researching. On the whole, the experience was really rewarding for me too, and I'm extremely grateful to my students who are listed here for their participation in this project, and for also opening up my mind to the topic, an old topic of mine, in new ways. So this is the way I assigned the readings per group. First group, second group, third group, and group F. Group F was the group that spoke French and read French. So we were able to cover lots of literature in French and some in German as well. And then sample annotations became summaries. These are the shortest ones. At the beginning, they were 2 pages long, but it worked quite well in the end. These are some of the presentations that were prepared by the students. This one focusing on Auguste Bope, which was our opening text. We had an article on chess playing mechanical Turk and Viennese entertainment for the court, or the 18th century female interest in in Turkey. And we had a topic, Ottoman influences on Western dress. Yes, comparing Ottoman and Western representations of female figures. Topic on Van Moor and Lyotard were also part of the project. Recueil Ferriol, Maria Teresa, which was very popular with some students. Lyotard, as I mentioned. Hammam, or public bath, Turkish public bath, was also dealt by this group. Coffee houses, Turkey in portraits, American portraits, or by the French philosophers dressing up as Turks. So this is the original talk I provided for the students to build upon, but none of them dared to actually intervene because I asked them to use the track change facility to add or delete sections. Instead, they came up with their own categories, which was again very interesting. Something like politics and history, art and culture, and then they divided those categories into subsections. Group 3 had their own overviews: East-West cultural contact, research resources, enlightenment, women. Group 2 came up with histories of the Ottoman Empire. They felt this was an important category to include in this bibliographic exercise, or geographically defined histories, travel diplomacy. I'm not going to get into the details, but group 1 kind of disintegrated. So each student in the group decided to come up with their own categories. This in itself was interesting. Final projects turned out to be mini bibliographic essays. This is by Ayman Ali, dealing with ambassadorial relationships between Ottoman and French Empire. Shoshi Rosen provided a bibliographic essay on fiction. Fascinating approaches sort of emerged out of this project. Ellen Elderly, who is now a doctoral student at Bard College, focused on Turkey and fashion, provided a absolutely wonderful bibliographic essay. Anna Cohn came up with a topic on the bath, disseminating bathing practices in Europe, especially focusing on Lady Mary and Madame de Pompadour. So these are samples of my student works, very high level engagement with the topic. Even though we didn't succeed in providing a wholly collective bibliographic essay as I imagined, I benefited enormously from this exercise. And this is the final project. If you go to the Oxford Bibliographies online, you will see Turkey. That's the link. There is, of course, a mishap. It had to be. When I submitted my manuscript in August, and you can see here, I gave the list, the names of my students to be acknowledged. Of course, when it was published, my students' names were not there, neither an acknowledgement. So I wrote, it will be redeemed, but in July when they can update. It's interesting that they can't even have access to their own websites once the article is published. So they can only update at a particular moment. So their names will appear on in July 7th or 17th. This is the final project, and these are the final categories. So this experience as a whole has been beneficial to me enormously, but I think also that empowered my students in many ways to engage with these kind of projects. So they are not alienated with this idea of, oh my God, there's so much out there and I don't know where to start from. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nabi. Over to you, Emma, if you can share your screen and start. Also, I'm going to take my privilege as one of the conveners that if you are going over time, I might intervene and speak if you're not able to look at the time warnings. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Emma, we can hear you. And
okay, great. Thank you very much, Sarah and Dipti, for inviting me to talk to this for this terrific workshop. My perspective on the topic we're discussing today is very much of a Europeanist, not a specialist. It's based on my experience of working at the Open University, a distance learning institution in the UK where the majority of students are mature part-time learners. OU modules are large collaborative endeavours, for each of which we produce several textbooks, plus an anthology of source texts and critical readings, as well as extensive online material, including videos. The starting point for my comments today is our most recent BA module, Art and its Global Histories, launched 2017, which explores the history of art via Europe's interaction with the rest of the world from the 14th century to the present day. It's obviously a survey course that is trying to engage with some of these recent developments in the discipline, and the textbooks and the reader are published by Manchester University Press. The 18th century is explored in book 2 of the module, Art, Commerce and Colonialism, 1600 to 1800, which I edited, but there is also some 18th century material in book 3, Art and Empire, British India, edited by my colleague Renata Doman, but it's otherwise mostly concerned with the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. Art, Commerce and Colonialism includes chapters on the art of Spain's American colonies, the impact of commerce and colonialism on Dutch 17th century art, chinoiserie in 18th century Britain, and colonial architecture in North America and the Caribbean. Although the emphasis is still on art as traditionally defined in the European tradition, the book considers a range of visual and material culture, including mats, wallpaper, porcelain, textiles, so on. I contributed a substantial introduction and the chapter on Dutch art, which I chose to write on despite my specialism being 18th century French art, partly for the practical reason that it allowed me to draw on a rich body of existing literature on the global history of Dutch art. What I'd like to suggest today, on the basis of my experience of working on this textbook, is that it is important to think again about the issue of periodization. In speaking of the long 18th century, we're inevitably taking our cue from British historians who have defined the period as starting in 1660 or 1688 and running to 1815 or perhaps 1832. The main alternative paradigm with which we work, that of the early modern period, may be less parochial, but entails its own problems, most obviously that it submerges the 18th century into the Renaissance. Any such periodization is obviously liable to accusations of Eurocentrism, insofar as it takes European initiatives as the main point of reference, in addition, of course, to the Christian origins of the calendar itself. However, my main suggestion would be that incorporating more of our teaching of the 17th century into, more of the 17th century into our teaching of the 18th century does at least have the benefit of focusing attention on the extent to which cross-cultural engagement in the Age of Enlightenment, as we call it, was shaped by the establishment of overseas trading companies, the growth of colonial settlements, and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, all of which, of course, start well before 1700. And if anything, I think, we should really talk about the age of mercantilism. Rethinking periodization, of course, also entails reconfiguring the geographies of art history, both away from the nation state as a bounded entity and away from Europe towards the rest of the world. Obviously, our textbook only represents a very limited move in that direction, but we do seek to highlight alternative geographical configurations that span oceans and continents. This has meant, for example, that's from my chapter on Dutch art, that is just as a slide from the virtual learning environment, of course. But anyway, as I say, trying to these alternative geographical configurations. Seeking these out has meant, for example, adopting a model of Hispanic art that embraces both the Iberian Peninsula and Spain's American colonies, as well as considering Britain's North American colonies in tandem with those in the Caribbean. In fact, the chapter on colonial architecture in the British Atlantic world that I mentioned earlier was originally intended to discuss, but unfortunately didn't for lack of space, another British colony, namely Ireland. And I think for anybody who is a British specialist or an Americanist, I would emphasize the value of incorporating the case of Ireland into a consideration of these larger histories, if it's not something you've thought of doing before. As anyone will know who's visited Dublin, it is a colonial capital, substantially rebuilt in the 18th century, comparable to, say, Philadelphia. I'd also like to draw your attention to Finola O'Kane's research on the plantation landscapes of Ireland and the Caribbean. So I think this really is a very interesting combination to think about. But more generally, I would like to emphasize the pedagogic value of comparative perspectives across both time and space. The so-called Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century, for example, offers a point of reference for exploring developments in 18th century France, Britain, or America, because the very rapid success of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, founded 1602, meant that luxury goods from Asia were widely available in the Netherlands significantly earlier than elsewhere in Europe. A useful concept developed for the Dutch context, but also more widely applicable, is the historian Jan de Vries' notion of a new luxury based on comfort and enjoyment rather than status and show. And this is just a slide from a chapter on the Britain in the 18th century. But equally, however, it's important to contrast positive accounts of the benefit of global trade for affluent consumers in Europe, such as Joseph Addison offered in 1711, and I put the quote up there, against more critical perspectives that take account of its destructive effects for the indigenous inhabitants of other regions of the world, such as were already beginning to be articulated, albeit only in a very limited way, by Adam Smith in 1776. Doing so helps to avoid the risk of downplaying the human costs of 18th century trade and consumption for colonized and enslaved, and indeed also the poor within Europe. So I wanted to make those general remarks before I hope switching to a website. I hope everybody can see that I've switched. Can somebody tell me, can you see the traveling objects displayed on the screen?
Not yet, Emma.
What are you seeing? Still my slides?
That's right.
You probably need to stop your share and then restart it with a new window.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me go back to my, oh shit. Okay, so, well, let me just tell you a little bit about it before I attempt to do that. You can see this, a slide of traveling objects, I hope. Anyway, just to explain that we developed various online resources for this module, most of which are only available to our students, but this one, Traveling Objects, we got money to develop. It is publicly accessible, and the aim is to allow students, or indeed anyone, to explore the trajectories across time and space of 9 selected objects from the 15th century to the present day, 4 of which date from the long 18th century, and others also date from also the more recent ones are also relevant to the 18th century. So I'm going to stop the share and start again, and I hope this works. And thank you for your patience. Can people see this?
Not yet.
Oh, hang on. How do I don't know how I share my screen from here. Let me think.
Emma, why don't we just drop the link in the chat? If you just drop the
yeah, I'll do that. I'm sorry, we should have.
No worries. No worries.
We should have tried this before.
If you drop it in the chat, I'll pull it up and share it.
Okay, let me. So. Okay, so that hopefully has that shown up?
Yes.
Okay, so, well, I will just go back to sharing my screen, and then at least you'll, okay, you'll see an image of it. Okay, so traveling objects has this series of objects which you can explore. You know, clicking on a link, it gives you a journey to travel with the object. And I mean, they're not all literally journeys of that specific object, but they explore the complex trajectories in which they're embedded. One is the chinoiserie bed, well, with Indian hangings, I should say rather, of the actor David Garrick. The one that I wrote the text myself was centered around Jean-Etienne Lyotard's still life, tea tray with the Getty Museum, where I explored, you know, the trajectories of Chinese porcelain coming to Europe, the way in which Chinese porcelain was itself affected by engagement with the West, both in terms of designs and in the case of the kind of china that seems to lie behind the ones on this tea tray depicted here, which was actually used a new technique which had been invented in Leiden. It explores the history of tea drinking. It explores also the travels of Lyotard himself to Constantinople, the way that rather extraordinarily to our eyes, his painting style was considered exotic. And you know, in one case at least, even compared to Chinese painting. It talks about, you know, imitations in Europe. The other examples are Tipu's tiger, seized by the British when they took Mysore. And so each of these objects, you can click on a link, you can explore the trajectories of the object. It's just a nice little beginning thing to introduce to students. I should say that you have to click on the dark lines on either side to scroll down the bottom of the page to continue to see the whole of the image and the way that the text continues. So I hope once people look at the website itself, that will be clear. And each one ends with a quiz, a multiple choice quiz that allows, you know, the student to test their knowledge, what they've learned in following this journey. Each also includes a link to a bibliography that, you know, provides further reading, and it also then gives you a link. In some cases, it's to the museum website the object comes from. In the case of the Lyotard, it links to a little film that I made for a website we have called Open Arts Objects, which is a little film about Chardin's Lady Taking Tea, which is also referenced in this traveling object. And we use these select traveling objects in the very beginning. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. And this is perfect actually, because we've dropped the link as a lure for our attendees who can explore this on their own and be rewarded with a quiz at the end. And who doesn't love that? Thank you so much, Emma. We're going to need to move along to Ananda.
Thank you.
This is wonderful and really appreciate this resource.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Ananda Cohen Aponte, and I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. I have already learned so much, taken copious notes, and I'm just so excited to be able to integrate some of these resources into my own teaching. So for today's mini discussion, and I'll make sure to keep an eye out on the time, I'm going to be talking about teaching the long 18th century, collaborative, community-driven, and student-centered approaches. And so even I kind of similar to Anna, I'm somewhat of an interloper. I teach predominantly courses on pre-Columbian and colonial Latin American art, although my recent research on anti-colonial rebellions of the late 18th century have really pushed me into a more, into the broader field of 18th century studies. And I'm just so amazed at the great work of Journal 18 and the work that's being done, particularly in this past year, to bring resources to all of us as we teach online and navigate these new waters. And so I'm going to be talking predominantly about my work on Pathways to Art History, which was briefly mentioned during the intro, which is a pilot program that I've been cobbling together through small grants, and I have some other initiatives that are underway in the years to come. But just to foreground that in relationship to some of the teaching that I've been doing in the last couple of years. So the first thing that I want to just talk about is really for us to think about who our students are, and in particular, our undergraduate community. Gen Z, right? Students who were born after 1996. And I think the one sobering thing for me as I teach is I realize that most of my students were born right around or have no memory of 9/11. So this is just really important, I think, for me and maybe for others to think about where our students are coming from generationally and how we need to continue to adapt in ways that builds on their strengths and engages us in some really interesting dialogical relationships with our students, and generative and creative ones as well. So members of Gen Z, as many of us probably already know, are more racially and ethnically diverse than any previous generation and are on track to be the most well-educated generation yet. And we also are seeing increasing numbers of underrepresented students who are making up college enrollments. So Latinx students make up about 17% of college enrollments. And I should mention that that number jumps to around 25 to 30% when we're considering the UC system, or also on the East Coast when we think about the CUNY system. And this is a 114% increase in the past decade. Black students make up about 16% of enrollments, also a steadily increasing number. And for those of you who are also interested in tracking other demographic trends that I didn't mention in my PowerPoint, the National Center for Educational Statistics has really great Excel spreadsheets that encodes a lot of this information, and also breaks it up into discipline. But at the same time that we're seeing an explosion of POC students entering into undergraduate education, when we think about the professoriate, Latinxes make up just 4%, African Americans 6%, and Native Americans less than 1%. And these percentages truly veer into the realm of near statistical insignificance when we start to also think about humanities and the arts. And so one thing that I have really thought about a lot over the last couple of years is how are we bridging this gap, in the sense that the demographics of our students are far outpacing the demographic makeup of the professoriate, and what are ways that we can ensure a pathway into the arts and humanities. As someone who's an art historian, I'm focused, of course, on art history, but also, you know, many of us are representing a number of different disciplines. And I've written about this at length, and I'm happy to share some of the publications that I've co-authored with some of my colleagues regarding this issue around equity in these fields. But one thing that I have noticed in terms of, we're seeing these unprecedented and very timely push to diversify arts institutions, humanities institutions, galleries, museums, and so forth. But many of these initiatives tend to look at this from a top-down perspective. And I've just tried to think about my role as an educator and what I can do also from the ground up. If we're thinking about how are we creating a critical mass of students who are learning these important histories, whether we're talking about histories of the long 18th century and their entanglements with colonialism and empire, whether we're talking about art history, and how are we creating a critical mass that's cultivating talent at the high school and early undergrad level. So that's really been my focus up at this point in time. And I really have been inspired by work that has been really important work that's been done in the realm of educational scholarship. And I've noticed that a lot of this scholarship is geared much more towards a K through 12 teaching community, but I think that university professors have so much to learn in the realm of educational literature and pedagogy. And so one book that I just wanted to mention briefly that has been a huge source of inspiration for me is Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching in the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. And so she defines abolitionist teaching as the practice of working in solidarity with communities of color while drawing on the imagination, creativity, refusal, remembering, visionary thinking, healing, rebellious spirit, boldness, determination, and subversiveness of abolitionists to eradicate injustice in and outside of schools. And so I've taken that as my guiding principles when I'm addressing my undergraduates, and it really has been a way for me to shift my thinking in terms of why I'm teaching, for whom am I teaching, and how am I doing this pedagogy? I think a lot of the panelists have already shown us some really wonderful collaborative ventures that they've taken with their students that I think is also very much reflective of the principles discussed here. And so I'll take us on a very brief journey into one particular project that I did with my students in spring 2019 that helps to bring some of this to life. I embarked on a project with the Multicultural Resource Center in Ithaca, New York. And I bring in the hyperlink here, or I wonder if someone can also drop it in the chat if anyone is interested in learning more about the MRC. So the MRC is a local grassroots nonprofit organization based in Ithaca that is anti-racist at its core and is committed to decolonizing issues around racial equity in the community, is dedicated to community collaboration and partnership, as well as community education. And I served on the board for MRC for several years. And I was really inspired by some of the conversations that came up during our board meetings and the kinds of initiatives that they were trying to get off of the ground. And so I engaged in a partnership with the MRC for a class that I was teaching in spring 2019. This is my Latin American survey class that basically covers everything from around 2000 BC to today. So it covers millennia, it covers thousands of miles of geography, but it's a really rewarding class and I look forward to teaching it every spring. And I thought to myself, how can I really, if I'm really talking about pathways to art history, how can I actually put this into practice? And so this was a collaboration with my class and the board members of MRC and some of the major staff at the organization, in particular, Rose Florent, who continues to work at MRC and has done some amazing things there. And she had begun a project called The Resistance Cannot Be Stopped. And this consisted of a series of educational boards or panels that are hung up all around the space of the community center, which you can see featured in the slide. And it was a way of talking about resistance movements across history and time and space from a global perspective, in particular with an emphasis on Black and Indigenous resistance movements across the world. And I thought to myself, how can we tap into this ongoing project? And so one thing that I just want to make clear off the jump is that it was not a question of Cornell coming to MRC and imposing our vision for what we wanted to do, but really drawing from what Rose had already established and figuring out ways that we can work with that. And so let me see what the next slide is. So with the students, we had them do another iteration, or this was like the second year iteration of the Resistance Cannot Be Stopped, that was tailored to Latin American and Latinx art. So that was a way that we could do a tie-in to the actual themes of the class. And so I'm just showing you a couple of pictures and the poster that they put together. And this was a semester-long project that involved multiple field trips, both on the part of MRC members to Cornell and Cornell field trips to the community space downtown. And the students were involved in a lot of different aspects of putting this together. And one thing, and I know that one of the other panelists talked about questions around student interest and how to gauge that. And so right from the jump, what I did was, in recognition of the fact that there are some students who may be interested in this community component and others who really are in an overtaxing, over-demanding academic schedule, I actually gave them the choice if they wanted to either do a traditional route where they would just write standard papers and take an exam, or if they wanted to do the community component. This also just enabled students to have the agency to choose one of those tracks and to also ensure that with the community aspect, that all of the students who were involved were very much engaged in this. And I'm sorry, I don't have my chat open, but am I okay on time, or do I have like a minute or two?
You are actually over time, Anna.
I'm sorry.
So,
okay.
But this is very fascinating, but perhaps this is a good space to move to the next speaker, or if you have one sentence, then that's about it. And we can discuss more in the, after everybody's presented.
Absolutely. Let me just finish showing the different slides just to show you the diversity of contributions that happened. So a YouTube channel that has interviews, educational packet for teachers, and then thinking about how to do this in an online setting this semester. So we can talk about this more during the discussion. And I apologize for going over.
No, no worries. This was fascinating to actually see how you stepped out of the classroom into this experimental space. So can I invite Preeta to start her presentation?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can everybody see my screen well? My PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I want to thank Dipti and Sarah for the opportunity to be part of this wonderful roundtable, and of course, thanks to everyone at UVA, especially Eleanor, who helped make this happen. Today, I will introduce you to what I think oceanic art histories might offer us by sharing with you aspects of a seminar that I taught last semester. For me, the Indian Ocean, specifically the Swahili coast, and the lives and experiences of Africans in the Indian Ocean have been a key platform to teach and think differently. Here you see a list of the 4 questions that animated our classroom discussions, with number 3, what is the relationship between oceanic aesthetics, slavery, and empire, being the one that was the most pressing, but also the most challenging to deal with. This seminar focused on illuminating connections and entanglements that transcend continental divides. But we also foregrounded entanglements of racialization, ethnicity, and nationalism. I right away want to emphasize that for me, the oceanic as a framework is not an extension of what is called global art history. To me, most accounts of the global begin with some admission that art history was once Eurocentric, but that by adding lots of quote unquote non-Western examples to the discipline and by focusing on trans-regional connectivity, our work is done. This is the same art history of the past, now masquerading in the colors of the world. Objects, artworks, people, and places are flattened out into stories of flows. This art history suggests that fungibility is just the natural state of things. In this version of art history, colonial modernity is in fact celebrated. For me, the Indian Ocean lays bare that even our large categories, such as Africa, Europe, the West, local, and global, are not neutral givens, but signposts of a very specific historical moment when discrete spaces such as Europe and Africa became operative for the modern management of power. Now, obviously, the Indian Ocean is a site of globalization as well, and who can move freely here and who can consume oceanic culture is about power and competition. While ports are in many ways about mobility and long distance exchange, they are also places of exploitation. I cannot think of one major port in Africa that is not touched by the history of slavery. But instead of deploying a macro scale perspective, in this class, we focused on matter and materiality and what happens when mobile things in a network come to rest. A focus on materiality, as opposed to the discursive and imaginary, also foregrounds how objects are used to make claims on people and territory. We foregrounded such themes as disrupting the story of art historical influence. And this disruption was very much led by Nancy who was our guest at the seminar that day. During the class on objects, objectified people, we focused on how the mobility of objects was constituted by the mobility of the enslaved. Then we embraced models from material culture studies to think about the usefulness of the commodification consumption dyad. Each student focused on one object type or commodity, such as porcelain, which has been avidly imported on the Swahili coast since the early modern period. Quite frankly, people are initially bedazzled that such a seemingly remote place like a tiny port city on the coast of Kenya has an ancient tradition of amassing hundreds of porcelain dishes, including as architectural ornament. Swahili porcelain display and consumption connects to all kinds of other displays of porcelain. Swahili Zidaka rooms have compelling formal affinities to rooms across the ocean. Now we can say many specific things about this display, how it relates to women's ability to curate the world in their homes, how porcelain has talismanic qualities. But the ability to fill one's house with beautiful exotic objects was linked to reducing human beings into trade objects, whose forced labor in turn produced new commodities for the world market. But this relationship between porcelain and slavery was very specific. For example, in 1776, a Dutch merchant visited Lamu to present porcelain dishes to a local merchant to seal a contract for the delivery of enslaved Africans to Dutch farmers in Cape Town. Following the life history of ivory also allowed us to think of its many transformations from living being to commodity to artwork. While the ivory sculpture on the left is usually discussed as an example of early export art, the fact that this sculpture shows a woman stripped bare and forcibly being held in this position by two fully dressed white men speaks volumes about the African experience of quote unquote, the mobility of objects. Object histories are about objectification and consumption in myriad ways, ways that go far beyond the cultivation of taste. Here it is important to foreground bodies and lived experiences, including the complexities of embodiment. So in this component, when we focus on ivory, we also focus on the fact that the Swahili coast is not just a maritime oriented space, but a space oriented to the Central African heartland, and that the trade of ivory, of course, connects the coastal regions with the African heartland, but there are many shared cultures of ornamentation, of the arts of regalia that connect the coastal region to Africa itself. And in this particular section, we also focus on the fact that we can never think of ivory without also thinking of the bodies of people who wore them and the bodies of people who had to carry them. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prita. We'll pass the mic to Nancy.
Okay, hi, I hope you can all see this, and I hope that I'm unmuted. First, I'll just start by saying that I am really impressed that Dipti and Sarah have been able to bring together such a broad, diverse, and truly vibrant group of 18th century art historians, and I'm really honored and excited to join this roster and this conversation. So my contribution to this roundtable is a student project on interactive mapping, and you can see it here on the screen. And I realize that it might look to be quite sparse. Maybe Eleanor will help me out by dropping a link to this document into the chat. And if you are interested in this topic, I would suggest that you take a look at the PDF because it's got a lot of resources that are embedded in hyperlinks. So it kind of links out to a whole series of different kinds of directives and tutorials that add on to what you see on the screen. So I'll just start by talking about maps and mapping in a very particular way today. So first of all, along with Prita, who I'm very pleased to follow, I'm also an Indian Ocean specialist. And as we all acknowledge, this is truly a vast maritime sphere. But I'll say that when I started my work, I really began on a focused level, practicing what the historian Francesca Trivelato has called global history on a small scale, with a kind of proposal that one could understand maritime phenomenon and kind of widespread and far-reaching maritime phenomena through the lens of a single port city. But as my work on the Indian Ocean moved on, somehow the purview continued to get larger and larger. And some of my most recent projects have been a bit kind of untamable in terms of their scope, stretching all the way from that Red Sea region that I started in to the shores of China and Japan and further. And as these arguments have become much wider and more far-flung in terms of their dimensions, and also entailing more complex movements of objects particularly, I came to realize that I needed to create my own maps, to use them as crucial expository tools in pushing forward arguments that hinge upon specific geographical movements that are grounded in time. And I do recognize that this might seem to be something outside of the scope of the long 18th century, but I also just want to point to basically every single one of my predecessors here in this roundtable who has pointed to the ways in which for the long 18th century and the way that we are thinking about it, we must grapple with new spatial formations and work work with dynamic geographic conceptions. And so mapping is relevant, I believe, and I hope will have resonance for all of you. And I do want to be clear that I'm not talking about maps as things or as artifacts. I'm talking about making maps as critical exercises that go beyond their mere didactic purposes. And indeed in art history, and I would say in early modern studies in general, there's been a lot of interest in the crucial practice of making. And in fact, many of us as scholars have ventured into workshop spaces, gotten our hands dirty, and really dealt with the kind of materiality of the things that we look at in more pristine, finished form. But I would like to, just as a provocation, insert into that discussion an understanding of those things that we make that reside and circulate in the digital world, because those are processes of making as well. And indeed, so many, again, of the people who preceded me in this roundtable have talked about the things that they have made for this digital space. And for me, making things that are digital, like a map or a website or an application, all of these are equally as engaged with these questions of process that I think are entailed in the discussion of making, as art historians and early modern studies people have taken this up. So this thinking about mapping as opposed to maps has really taken shape also very fully in my classrooms. And this is where we come to teaching the long 18th century. And I've used various mapping platforms and interfaces for student projects over the years. And if people are interested, we could talk about this. They have met with both success and failure. And I'll be happy to share both of those with the group, whoever is interested. But the particular project that I'm presenting here was developed for my most recent course, which is not focused on the 18th century, but again, I hope still will be relevant. It was called Art History in the Digital Age. And I taught it in fall 2020. It was an undergraduate and graduate joint seminar. And I will say that I pitched it very purposefully, not as a digital art history course, because I feel like that kind of framing somehow scares graduate students away. We can talk about why this might be the case. So I framed it in slightly a different way, a related way though, which is really just asking the question of what kinds of research tools, and in fact, tools of persuasion, must an art historian of this moment be willing to mobilize, with the understanding that our research landscape has been radically transforming, I would say, certainly for the past decade, although of course, some of these transformations became more palpable to us since COVID, right? And so to that end, this class was undergirded with an intensive technological agenda built around the open source programming language R, which is a kind of Swiss Army knife of computational method that I've become increasingly committed to using in my own work, but also teaching with the contention that working in this way, I mean, any programming language is a language that must be learned with its syntax and its kind of dialects as well. But it is a fundamental way of knowing, thinking, and working that is fit to our particular moment and its challenges. And I think useful and I would say generative for those of the upcoming generation of art historians to engage with. And I'm not going to go into the details of this tutorial, but again, I invite you to work with it and to let me know. I haven't user tested it yet. I designed it so that anyone who has no experience making a digital map, has never worked with a programming language R, could do it. But again, you will all tell me if I have failed there, and I'll have to keep on iterating it to make sure that they can get there. I will tell you that this works with a package called Leaflet. And whenever you see an interactive map in a digital project, if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, it will usually tell you how it was made. And many of these maps were made with Leaflet. So it's a really actually very widespread package, even if you might not be aware of the fact that you've used Leaflet maps in the past. So it's great to teach students as well. But rather, I will ask Eleanor now to drop those two links, two maps that were made in conjunction with this tutorial that you could click on the links for and engage with on your own browsers. One of these maps was produced by me, and it's called 4 Objects. It's one of the sample maps that you can see on my screen. And that was produced as a companion to a presentation that I recently did that is very much grounded in the 18th century. And the second map, I will say, is not oriented around the 18th century at all, but it was produced by one of my students, Alyssa Abisamis, who is an MA student in art history at Binghamton, who took the course with me. And the reason that I bring these two maps together with this project and the associated materials that I've shared with you is because they were all co-created concurrently. And so many of the others before me have talked about dialogic processes of teaching and learning and kind of collaborative spirits within the classroom. And I really want to build upon all of that, because producing this for me was really a kind of dynamic and iterative process in that, I produced this tutorial to teach it, right? I didn't even know how to use Leaflet until I thought I was going to bring it into the classroom, which of course is the case for so many things that we learn them to teach them, right? And then I began to work with Alyssa and the other students to produce their maps as one component of the class. And that was a really exploratory process, in which we were not using these maps as kind of declarations of positivistic proposals, but rather as explorations and kind of using maps to see things differently and in different ways, and working together, acknowledging our limits and trying to produce something that was, again, in the end, entirely collaborative. And by the way, with those maps, I encourage you to just kind of click onto the dots, and they should open up these pop-ups, which is where a lot of the substance comes up, and images are featured as well, and they're pretty sparse. I would say I could have done more to build the content, and that's where I think some of the richness of these maps can be developed for in the future for projects that I think could be even more intensive and useful in this way. And so in keeping with time, and I think I'm kind of done here or close to the end of my period, I do just kind of want to make the provocation, in fact, that, this idea of introducing technology in the classroom and, engaging in these kind of processes to me is really important. And I want to be really clear and really kind of counter any possible perceptions that my agenda is one of kind of techno-chauvinism, right? That this is, about all these new and flashy things, because really to the contrary, for me, integrating technology into the classroom has been a key vehicle that I've used to overturn those structures of hierarchical expertise transfer that we have been trained in, all right? And that is because whenever you teach technology in the classroom and you really give it space in that in the classroom, knowledge flows are inherently and implicitly much more circular. It entails all the time uncertainty, and it hinges upon failure. And I will tell you, failure is a word we never use in the humanities, in the academic sphere. And I feel like we need to normalize the notion of failure. And of course, when you're working, with R or with any programming language, your code is going to fail 15 times before you get it to run. And kind of normalizing my own failure as a teacher, my students' failure as something completely acceptable, to me has been absolutely liberating to really rethink the possibilities of the pedagogical space that I aspire to. And so I hope that some of this kind of thinking, some of these hopes for kind of the future of our discipline, might help to generate some thinking around this roundtable. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks for keeping us to time and talking about failure and vulnerabilities that are absolutely important to center as we think about pedagogical models. So with that, I'll invite Steve, our last speaker, before we launch into questions.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can do this successfully. Are you looking at the Qianlong Emperor now? Yeah, cool. Well, thank you very much. It's really just an incredible pleasure to be here. And I have both the privilege and the burden of going last. This is a terrible act, a terribly tough act to follow. But though the comments that I will make today are pretty brief, I'm very grateful to follow so much of the things that have been said today, particularly Anna's opening with a provocation about the emphasis on the importance of place, Preeta's resistance to notions of global art histories, which I agree are deeply problematic in many respects, and also Nancy's introduction to the world of productive mapping, which is very, very important to my own work and to my own thinking about place, though I've not yet been brave enough to actually take it into a classroom. Today, I will be focusing on several intertwined strands of my MA course at the Courtauld, which is called Beijing and Beyond, Art and Empire in Early Modern China, which focuses on connected histories of art and architecture in and beyond the Qing court in the long 18th century. To start, it's useful to briefly introduce the Courtauld and its MA, as these are probably somewhat unusual for many of you. The Courtauld is a specialist university focusing on art and architectural history and conservation. Although the very first British art history degree was offered in Chinese archaeology by the Courtauld beginning in the 1930s, for most of its history, the Courtauld has been strongly associated with the study of European art, only recently expanding its teaching into Asia with the appointments of colleagues in early modern Islamic and contemporary art. Following on this geographical emphasis, the Courtauld's teaching and research have long been divided into so-called period sections: Byzantine and medieval, Renaissance, early modern, and modern and contemporary, of which I most naturally fit into early modern. In a perhaps belated effort to reflect the changing terrain of our field, we have recently introduced new transtemporal and geographic research groups, including Connecting Cultures, focusing on transcultural concerns, and Courtauld Asia. Finally, the Courtauld MA centers on a year-long research-intensive seminar with an individual lecturer, which consists of twice-weekly seminars, several smaller writing assignments, and an extended dissertation. One of the assessments particular to my own course involves collaborations between my students and those of my colleague Suzanne Babei, who teaches Persianate cultures. Called Transasias, these object-centered research projects aim to think about connections within Asia rather than between Asia and Europe, as is the current norm, and are prepared for publication through Things That Talk, a digital project originating in Asian studies at the University of Leiden. In addition, all students take part in what we call a shared interest seminar during the autumn term. Organized by period, my students join those in other early modern seminars on art and experience in Isfahan, Dutch nature and science, the 18th century circum-Atlantic world, mapping and empire, and British architecture. Each lecturer leads a seminar of their own devising. Mine, which I will discuss further below, focuses on periodization and time. Together, the series is called What Makes the Early Modern, and takes many of its cues from authors who have been foundational to my own thinking about the early modern as a period: Foucault, Subramanian, Desserteau, etc. Having now taught at NMI-MA for 2 years, however, we, my colleagues and I, have jokingly begun to refer to it as early modernity and its discontents. And it is this change and the issues of how to situate the study of Qing art in local and world historical time that I want to focus on. Originally, my MA sought to explore so-called connected histories of art and architecture in early modern China, centered on the court and its local and more distant networks from circa 1500 to circa 1800. My use of early modern was quite intentional, as I was particularly interested in the periodization's formulation through debates in the late 1990s in the journal Modern Asian Studies and elsewhere, which recognized demographic change and transformations in physical, technological, and communicative mobility as essential characteristics of a trans-Eurasian, if not fully global, early modern period. The roots of this debate and scholarship outside Europe, South and Southeast Asia in particular, made it especially attractive to me as I sought to reposition my presentation of art in China away from either deeply Sinocentric or deeply Eurocentric teleologies. As my teaching of the course evolved, however, certain challenges arose. The first was that the period was simply too broad, even for a year-long course, particularly given the research-intensive nature of the degree. Moreover, I found that despite my great interest in the seemingly early modern visual and spatial cultures of the 16th and early 17th centuries, I was especially drawn to the intersecting problems of space, identity, ethnicity, and empire that characterized the early and high Qing period, effectively the long 18th century. This shift has not obviated either the early modern or the high Ming from my course, both of which remain important touchstones. It has freed us, my students and I, however, to focus on what Karima Lashir, Sarah Marzagora, and Francesco Orsini term the significant geographies of the Qing, the local, temporal, as well as spatial specificities of the Qing as it is enmeshed within networks of human imaginative, and temporal connection and signification. In my seminar for What Makes the Early Modern, I focus primarily on the particularities of local times, seeking both to undermine the hegemony of Eurocentric modernities and to question notions of regional modernities, which, to my mind, often still rely on what amount to European markers of social or economic development, however deracinated. I introduce the sprouts of capitalism argument by which some Chinese scholars have situated the modern in 11th century China. Discuss James Cahill's notes on post-historical painting, which frames post-Yuan art as fundamentally engaged in historicized reworkings of earlier models and styles. And look at this portrait in red landscape by Xiang Shengmo, a leftover subject of the Ming who expressed his dynastic and therefore calendric loyalty through red ink, a homophone, the word for red being a homophone for the Ming family name Zhu, painted in the year 1644 that later annals would mark as the end of Ming time and the commencement of Qing time. I begin and end the seminar with William Kentridge's The Refusal of Time, playing a clip of this discordant multimedia installation as students enter the room, or Zoom, as it has been in the last year, in order to foreground the messy upsetting of unitary time that I want to explore in our discussions. Kentridge's piece offers the synchronization of clocks circa 1880 as a marker for the onset of modernity. Though this would be somewhat later than I would end the so-called long 18th century in China, nonetheless, we can think of such a thing, stretching from various conquest era milestones in 1644, 1679, 1688, or 1696, to the onset of significant conflicts in China in 1796, 1839, or 1850, with roots and branches stretching much further in either direction. Laying between many of the early modern transformations of the High Ming and laying the foundations for the territorial reach and ethnic nationalism of modern China, the long 18th century of my course seems to suggest a liminal or transitional space between the early modern and the modern, akin to the world of Foucault's Don Quixote, in which eras and epistemologies overlap and encounter one another just as people and cultures do. While this proposition perhaps only creates more questions, it also brings my students back to where I would most like them to be, seeking explanations for what they see in the materials and words of the period and place itself, telling stories of relation and connection that are rooted in the spatial and temporal local. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to all of our panelists. Realizing that this is bad form in our Zoom universe, we have been given the green light to bleed over a little bit. Thank you to the IHGC for their flexibility. So we'll be going a little bit longer. The absolute max out will be at 11:15, and folks who need to peel off will do so as they need to. Eleanor, to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all of the panelists for these wonderful remarks. I want to start with the first question while our audience is thinking of their own to please post in the Q&A. And I want to ask this question from my positionality as a graduate student and focus on the space of the classroom. Each of you described so beautifully different intellectual or even physical moves beyond the borders of the traditional classroom, such as decentering yourself as the sole voice of authority and inviting in or collaboratively teaching with other experts, relocating to interstitial university spaces such as the library or museum or even cultural sites abroad, and also engaging students in collaborative and community-based projects that reach beyond the single classroom and the university altogether. And while that physical travel outside the classroom was of course disrupted this year due to COVID, Zoom has also allowed for the inclusion of voices that may not have otherwise been able to come into your classrooms. So my question, does a worlding of art history require also a decentering of the professor and a mobility in and out of the classroom that reflects the patterns of the people and the objects that we study? Thank you.
Whoever wants to start first with some remarks. Yes, Steve, please.
Well, since no one else, please cut me off when everyone else is ready. I think that the opportunity to think about the professor as a form of convener more than a form of lecturer is a really wonderful thing that has certainly occurred through Zoom to a degree. I know that I've welcomed people that I would never have been able to include, voices I've never been able to include this year for practical purposes. I also think that, for instance, at the Courtauld, we teach a great deal outside, and we have the great privilege, like colleagues at NYU, of living in a city where that's very possible. In the sense that the collections are there and available to us. I guess my other answer to that, though, would be that we still, we face significant institutional challenges around that. And also to a degree, student challenges. It was very interesting to hear Nancy talk about, to sort of foreground the idea of failure. I have found at times a sort of real tension between what I think represents progressive or evolving pedagogy and student expectations. At least in the UK, students still very much want to hear lectures. They want to know what they're being taught, and foregrounding the pedagogical method as well as the content is, I think, part of that. And also the UK represents a place where course structures are quite controlled or quite regulated, but to a degree, institutions everywhere set standards that we need to work with. We need to work with or work against to try to sort of change how a class may work, if that makes sense, to expand the notion of what a class may include.
Yeah, Nancy, please jump in. You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. So first of all, thank you, Eleanor, so much for that really great question. And I think, you know, it's a difficult moment right now for graduate students who are kind of looking at this uncertain and, you know, potentially precarious future right now. And so I think really kind of hearing from what graduate students are thinking and saying, and, you know, and want to happen in their classrooms is really, really important. And sometimes I feel like we don't listen enough to those voices. And, you know, I will I think, you know, things have really kind of shifted in the past year where so much discussion has changed about, you know, who we're hearing from, right? People have talked a lot about citational politics in a much more kind of, you know, vocal way. I know Ananda has written about that topic. Others in this group have talked about citational politics, you know, in the area that Preet and I work in the Indian Ocean. Huge rise in discussion about how few voices from the actual Indian Ocean are actually working in Indian Ocean studies, right? And that is acknowledged, and it is a huge problem, right? And so this question of who is speaking, I feel like we're finally having that conversation, maybe not as much in art history as we should be, but I think across fields. And so yeah, I just think kind of foregrounding that question, and not setting it aside like, oh, here's my intellectual content, and then, oh, I want to make sure that I have a few women of color in my syllabus, right? That is the content, right? And, you know, kind of making these really kind of unequivocal choices that, you know, hold up our ethical, you know, correspond to our ethical stances. Again, I think, and I hope we're at a turning point in terms of our commitment to listening, opening up the voices, listening, and giving platforms to voices that we haven't been listening to or we haven't heard.
If I can just also add something to that. In some ways, we've already seen such incredible models being presented about collaborative teaching. I just wanted to add that in some ways by accident, because I had to teach, of course, all online this semester. I'm even teaching my big introductory class into the arts of Africa online, which has over 40 students. And what I did there, because of course Zoom allowed it, which has been really incredibly enriching for the students, is that I actually give up the space for them to teach. And at first I was super nervous because of course many of them are freshmen, but I created these very clear collaborative projects where once a week we have a curator, an artist, a scholar from Africa or the African diaspora actually be their topic, their object, their interviewee. And they create these perfectly deeply researched scripts where they actually talk to an artist, a curator, a scholar in Africa. And they're writing before our eyes in the classroom new histories of the arts of Africa. And so far it's worked. I mean, they've blown me away. It's been an incredible model that of course doesn't get to the fact, deal with the fact that of course I'm still the professor. I have a stable job. I'm the one who doesn't face precarity when many people, who are interacting in this space maybe do.
That's such an excellent point. In terms of how you give space to, whom you give space to. And I wonder if others want to jump in, because I saw that, of course, that was addressed in Ananda's talk, and I think Anna's talk as well, as you were talking about how the collaborations with the students went in various directions. And I was thinking about Navi's talk as well, where the table of contents was and how it was changed, and thinking about the rhizomes that were there in Anna's talk as to, and that brings up in some ways what Nancy was saying, like, what is the medium? How are you mapping and getting your hands dirty to arrive at something? So yeah, please feel free to jump in if there were points as well that you weren't able to highlight, that you want to highlight with regards to this question before we move to more.
Perhaps I can come in very quickly. I think team-taught courses are very useful in that sense. However, nowadays the universities don't have enough resources or money to encourage team-taught courses. In fact, we are supposed to teach larger student groups and not team-taught at all. Some of my students who are taking my courses on the Turkey or Ottoman Empire and the world around them tells me, how come we never heard of the Ottomans before? How come I've been taking 18th century courses, but I've never heard of the Turk, the figure of the Turk or the Ottomans or Islam, Islamic art. So I think maybe a team-taught course could actually be a way, a solution.
I am on the same page as yours, but I think we face the similar resistance in our own institutions. So I hear you about that as well. Yeah, any other responses or questions?
Ananda, I see your hand. Blending into your wall color.
I realize that, yeah. No, a lot of what has already been said really resonates, and I don't want to replicate what has already been mentioned. But when you mention about how students are asking, why is it that this is the first time that, I mean, that is something that really has hit me in every semester that I teach. And one of the things that I didn't get a chance to mention during my talk is that, for this semester, I think that with the rise of online teaching and the Zoom platform for doing so, in many ways is already collapsing the spatial hierarchy that's created from the classroom environment. And that was really something that came out when we were doing our MRC collaboration. And it was really the MRC staff members who were talking about, how the actual structure of the classroom with the podium at the front and the stadium seating in the back was already creating these kinds of relationships. And it was a really pointed or really notable that when we entered into the community space of that place, everyone was in a circle and everyone was kind of granted equal space. So with Zoom already, that's sort of breaking down. But one thing that I wanted to mention that I have done as a workaround for the limitations of not being able to gather in person is that for my class this semester, I've been in touch with teachers in the K through 12 system, and predominantly middle and high school teachers who are active in some anti-racist teaching groups that are on Facebook, that I asked them, you know, what kinds of educational materials are you looking for? Because our students can create them for you, and maybe they'll be useful. Maybe you can adapt them for your classes. And so for the last project for my semester, I'm having students respond to the needs of teachers and creating educational resources that include anything from just traditional lesson plans in PowerPoints to TikTok videos about Mexican murals. And so I think that there's ways for us to also sort of reach across these educational boundaries. And I think that with the rise of so many different online communities, that can be one way of being in the service of not only our own discipline, but in the service of education as a whole. So I'm happy to share some of those resources maybe in the chat, or those groups rather.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point that you highlight in that sense of stepping out of spaces and making use of these various kinds of mediums and be open to the fact that collaborations can come in a variety of forms. And I think in that sense, kind of highlighting the question of the pipeline to the not just the undergraduates who enter our classrooms, but the pipeline getting into college, the kind of program that you've set up is something to think about. Because also what struck me was that you're talking about resistance in relationship to the present in these spaces, and you're talking about the question of resistance in the 17th, 18th century, right? So in a way, then that's the way you're bringing that together. Other responses or hands that I might be missing? I guess like one question, because I think it was touched upon by all of you as well, is that you've come from various vantage points. And I think many of you, make it clear that it's not about pluralizing just the world, right? But questioning the structural logics that devise our discipline, whether one is coming through the oceanic, whether one is thinking about mapping as a critical intellectual tool, whether one is thinking about the interface between medicine and art history, between art and science, things that we think of as disparate in some ways. So I was wondering if that, that seems to be at the crux of this moment really, right? Where we are moving, where we are trying to think about temporality, but not just through the idea of pluralizing. And so it would be great if, we hear a little bit more about that. And I'm asking that because, I wonder in hearing to your papers as well, whether the temporal bounds play out or not when you slice, squeeze, or even slash certain arcs of history, right? That your certain material is in the center of the 18th century, but you're also kind of constantly slashing certain arcs. Like Stephen said, for him, it is about bringing certain significant ideas and geographies. And if the 11th century comes in there, it is a part of it, right? So in some ways, like how does the logic of temporality, which in some ways has been a way art history has been structuring itself for teaching, how much does that, how much does that bear as you paint these new arcs, these new genealogies, you dig from the plantation spaces, what is the logic of seeing that is set up? Yeah, Emma.
I wanted to ask an additional question to supplement yours, to come back to the question of temporality. I mean, I gave a fairly conventional presentation around challenging at the edges along 18th century, but a very standard one. I was blown away by the amazing array of topics, extraordinary array of topics that all my fellow panelists offered. But I would really, apart from Stephen, people didn't talk about the long 18th century. And I wondered, I would really like to know, do people find the long 18th century useful in their teaching, or would people really like to reject it? That is really the question I would like to have an answer to. Thank you.
Frida. I see.
I will somehow try to respond, probably not entirely effectively, to both questions. For better or for worse, I am trained, my primary disciplinary expertise, of course, is as an Africanist art historian. And for better or for worse, our Africanist art history has a strange life history within the larger discipline of art history. And the assumption is that our African art does not need chronology or temporality, right? And that can be a strength, and that can also be a weakness. On one hand, it's a strength. Of course, my primary methodology is actually historical ethnography. That is, I do field work also, right? But in fact, early on as a graduate student, as an Africanist, I felt that there was something, ahistorical about Africanist art history. And also it doesn't exist in the chronology, in the sort of temporal divisions of art history. It's sort of like a geographic add-on, right? But there are no sort of early modern, contemporary divisions in the way that Africanist art history is inserted. I just exist as a geography, as this gigantic continent, right? Which of course is one of the great banes of my existence, and I love complaining about that, but I will hold that for now. But of course, it can also be a strength, right? Because when I engage other colleagues in sort of neighboring disciplines like Dipti or many other of my colleagues, Meredith Martin, Barry Flood in the DAH here at NYU, I, of course, am promiscuously transhistorical, right? So, for me, like where I start temporally is like almost random, right? Because and in my own work, for example, I really do the post histories or the many lives of objects and architectures. For better or for worse, my entire book on the architecture of the Swahili coast was really not about the building and the moment of origin of buildings, but rather the many post histories and lives and memories attached to it, right? But working with people who are more temporally oriented, like Dipti, for example, and Meredith also in our department, actually has been an incredibly powerful way to rethink how I am an Africanist. For example, through Meredith's journal, Journal 18, I've actually had to think about how what I thought were fundamentally colonialist issues, 19th, 20th century issues, actually start in the 18th century on the Swahili coast. So I've actually been, this is rather simple, but actually having to go into the past has been actually really good for me to actually force the discipline of Africanist art history to be more, sophisticated in terms of the politics of time.
Are there others who would like to jump in? Yeah, Nancy.
So again, from the Indian Ocean, I mean, it's funny because I was trained as an Islamicist, right? And so, everyone who comes in from the Indian Ocean comes from some kind of landed tradition usually, right? And so, that's just, a field in which we've never had the privilege to divide by century, right? And so I just do want to make clear that for, to Europeanists, that is a privilege to kind of think in these segmented terms, because at least in a teaching program, certainly, there can be some kind of, obviously delineation, differentiation, and specialization, but we usually don't have that kind of privilege because we're kind of given these huge chunks. And of course, for Islamic art, I mean, it's just the span of time is kind of so ridiculously unwieldy from the 7th century, and many people bring in, go up until today with contemporary content. And so that kind of ability to divide by century is definitely something that, those in fields that have that kind of capaciousness or seeded that kind of capaciousness have and others don't. And so it's very uneven. And I will say, I'm someone who's been very tied to the 18th century within my work, but that is really only a byproduct of the fact that I have been very much tapped into the 18th century VOC sources. And I had a huge, right? And so my kind of attachment to the 18th century, I totally realized comes from my body of sources, which of course are European as a kind of driving mechanism behind my work. And so, just understanding those genealogies, I think is super important.
Let's hear from Stephen, and then Eleanor has a couple things from the questions from the chat. Oh, okay, Stephen, Anna, and then Eleanor. How about that?
Sure. Thank you. Since mine was cited as the one that sort of explicitly talked about the long 18th century, I will be honest that I've never before this panel used the long 18th century as an expression to describe my period or work. Like Nancy, I think that it's a little bit relates to time. When I first responded to this call, I noted that sort of coincidentally, the period that coincides with some version, some iteration of a long 18th century is a meaningful block of time in Qing history, but not because of any particular relationship to whatever the field knows as the long 18th century. What I really wanted to add though is that the Courtauld, I have a sort of quite unusual privilege, which is that the Courtauld only expects people to teach their specialism. And so I teach precisely what I want. For the first time in my career, I don't teach an Asia survey. I don't teach a China survey. I don't do anything like that. And like my colleagues in Africanist and Islamic studies, typically Asianist, you're an Asianist where you teach China and you teach Japan and you teach South Asia and you teach all sorts of things that, maybe I took a course in, but are not only not sort of naturally aligned. Just because I've studied Chinese art doesn't mean I know inherently anything about Japan. It's only because I've studied it. But also, as we see in geography, in sort of meta-geographic critiques, Asia is not a particularly useful or descriptive landmass any more than Africa or the Islamic world is, except by various coincidences. And so that was what really sort of I had a really good time thinking about for today, was how by sort of accident is the long 18th century a useful notion. The other thing that I would just add right at the end and then give over to Anna is that to a degree in China, because the Qing court specifically does have very, very strong connections with courts around it, with technological centers around it. The long 18th century, arguably in this particular area of inquiry, does have some broader connected utility. But it's also vitally important that we recognize that although histories of Chinese art in the 18th century that ignore or discard the type of work that's going on in the Qing court are as derivative or Central European or whatever, are vastly underappreciating what's happening in that material, so too do we have to recognize that for the vast, vast, vast majority of people in this thing that we call China or the Qing, Europe basically didn't exist. Like, there is no connected world. There are interregional connections, there are local connections, there are historic connections, but we're not talking about a truly global world in any meaningful way, I don't think.
Anna,
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, it's way past my bedtime, so I hope it makes sense. I was just wanting to reiterate a point made earlier about this sort of, I think Preeta was making this point about the kind of that sort of promiscuity in being trans-historical, which I love actually, because I think, speaking for someone who works in the field of Black diaspora, it's similar in that you don't really, you have to know the entire chronology from whenever to contemporary, but I think that's actually, it's actually very important, because when you're teaching, students know about the contemporary, but being able, for them to be able to make relationships to these, these historically historical artists who, again, they're sort of like, oh, why didn't I ever know about these artists? I think, you know, being able to have conversations across chronology, but I mean, and also obviously across regions, because if you're, you know, I'm trying to put together a Black diaspora survey of the 19th century, which is kind of everywhere, as it should be. But, you know, it's so I do think about using temporality, or at least the kind of trans-historical aspects of temporality, right? The connections that can be made across time as a way to help students interact in that way. But the other thing I would also say is that I think in some ways I don't want the kind of the temporality of some of these historically violent objects to disappear, because I think it's important that is part of how they act on the present, in order for us to understand, you know, how our present is still so much shaped by these past, but also to understand something that Lisa Lowe talks about, you know, that there could have been other pasts that can take us to other futures. And so I just think that, you know, that's one of the, I'm not giving a kind of, I'm not trying to explain everything here. I'm just saying, okay, this is, I think, one of the ways that we have to, or that I, in my teaching and research, kind of try to grapple with some of these questions that have been raised.
Yeah, means I think many of us come, myself included, from these very regional area studies kind of models of training. I come from training as a South Asian art history, South Asianist, and it's actually those conversations about what was happening with our respective objects and respective historicizations between Sarah and me that led us to wanting to have this question, not just about from various geographies, but also why a certain periodization can be useful, or what kind of stakes are there and why it needs to be claimed or not claimed in that sense, and how in a way that is an intervention to try to think about globalizing as not the only way to go forward in some ways, right? So, so I just wanted to put that there, but I know that perhaps Eleanor will at least quickly point us to some of the questions that are there, which some of them perhaps have been indirectly addressed, I'm not sure.
Yeah, some of them have, and just as a sort of ending note or food for thought moving forward, there were two questions that from Jennifer Marine and from Matthew Hunter that point towards both the digital art history, but also ways to engage undergraduates and graduate students, and asking the question of, you know, how can we use these digital tools to engage students at different levels, and do we have a sort of imperative to teach our students these skills so that they can use this in a changing job economy, and is there also sort of limitations on what we can do with that in the classroom, or even resistance to that from students who feel this need to professionalize? So I'll leave it there as a comment outstanding and return it to Dipti and Sarah to close us out.
Yeah, I think we're breaking new records for our inability to keep to time. So failure, thank you, Nancy, for bringing failure in as a value. We're glad to oblige. Just a really heartfelt thank you to our panelists for incredibly energizing and meaningful work that you're doing, and thank you for sharing it with us. I'm really struck by how many of you are showing us in the work you've put before us this morning, the way that we can sort of go back to the ground by objects, by mapping, by thinking about the raw historiographical matter that our students can use to build new kinds of accounts of what might in the future be or maybe not be called the long 18th century. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the IHGC and to the Mellon Foundation. We're really looking forward to continuing this conversation in the future. And Dipti, I'll let you have the final word.
No, I just echo Sarah's thanks, and I want to thank Eleanor as well, who is the one who's really made this possible. Otherwise, this roundtable would not have been realized in the last 3 months. I want to thank all of you for your provocations, and we'll send you some of the questions and chats, if we haven't been able to address them, because I think there is a lot of energy out there and wanting to think through this radicalism. Meredith Gamer says that, do we find resistance in investing time in that? Another question that was there, resistance in new methods in terms of how they take our time, what we train in, how the students have certain limitations. How do we think about both the question of investment and the kind of radicalism that we think will move us forward, to think through both the question of continuities, the ghosts, the murmurs that we all want to address in our teaching, right? So in the most honest ways, even as we fail to keep to time, and even as we fail to close. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience. And we'll connect with all of you. Bye.